Picture a cellar in the heart of London, deep beneath the Palace of Westminster. It's a place of shadows and secrets, cold enough that your breath fogs in the lantern light. The air itself is a noxious cocktail, thick with the smell of sulfur, damp earth, and stale wine from the casks that line the walls. But hidden among them is a far more volatile substance. A man waits in this subterranean gloom. He is patient. He is resolute. His name is Guy Fawkes. Piled around him, crudely concealed under a mound of firewood and coal, are 36 barrels of gunpowder. It's a colossal amount, more than enough to obliterate the House of Lords above, to turn the king, his queen, his heir, and his entire government into a cloud of red dust and splinters. The fuse is ready. The hour is near. But this isn't the story of a world-changing explosion. This is the story of what happens when the fuse is never lit. It's the story of a guard's lantern suddenly slicing through the oppressive dark, its beam catching a shocked face frozen in a moment of catastrophic failure. It's the story of a furious king, his sense of divine appointment so violated that his rage spills onto the page in furiously scribbled ink, demanding answers. It's a story that ends not with a bang, but with the sickening groan of a wooden torture rack and the spidery, almost illegible scrawl of a broken man's signature. This is the story of King James I giving his personal, royal go-ahead for torture, and a brutal, ritualized public execution meticulously designed to serve as a terrifying message to any who would dare challenge the crown. So, how much pain can one man endure before his body and soul are irrevocably shattered? And what happens when a failed plot to kill a king becomes an immortal legend, a global symbol of rebellion wrapped in the chilling reality of state-sponsored terror? To truly comprehend the torment of Guy Fawkes, to feel the cold dread of his final days, you have to understand the profound desperation that drove him and his fellow plotters into that cellar. Their actions did not arise from a vacuum. They were forged in the crucible of decades of religious persecution. The year is 1605, and for English Catholics, life is a waking nightmare. The kingdom is a hostile land where their faith, once the bedrock of the nation, is now deemed treasonous. For nearly half a century, under Queen Elizabeth I, the pressure had been mounting. The Act of Supremacy of 1559 declared her the supreme governor of the Church of England, and to deny it was treason. The Recusancy Acts made it illegal to attend Catholic Mass, forcing believers into secret worship in hidden chapels and priest holes. Those who refused to attend Anglican services were branded recusants and subjected to crippling fines of £20 a month, a sum that could bankrupt even wealthy gentry families over time. Priests caught on English soil were considered enemies of the state, agents of a foreign power. Many were hunted down, imprisoned, and executed in the most brutal fashion imaginable for the crime of treason. With Elizabeth's death in 1603, the ascension of King James I of England, who was already King James VI of Scotland, sparked a flicker of hope among the beleaguered Catholic community. James's mother, the tragic Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a devout Catholic martyr. His wife, Queen Anne, was rumored to be a Catholic herself. Surely, many reasoned, a king with such close Catholic ties would usher in an era of greater religious tolerance. Initially, James seemed to confirm these hopes, privately promising some prominent Catholics that he would ease the financial burden of the recusancy fines. But that hope was extinguished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Faced with a staunchly Protestant parliament and a privy council led by the cunning Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, James not only failed to deliver on his promises, but intensified the persecution. In early 1604, he publicly declared his utter detestation of Catholicism. The collection of recusancy fines was reinstated with renewed vigor, and new, harsher anti-Catholic legislation was enacted. For a small, tightly knit group of devout Catholic gentlemen, this was the ultimate betrayal. At the heart of this group was Robert Catesby, a man of immense charisma and influence. Catesby was no common rabble-rouser. Born into a prominent Warwickshire Catholic family, he was described as a tall, handsome, and athletic man, a skilled swordsman and a natural leader. His family had suffered immensely for their faith. His father had been imprisoned multiple times for harboring priests. Catesby himself was no stranger to rebellion. In 1601, he had participated in the doomed Essex Rebellion against Queen Elizabeth, an act for which he was wounded, captured, and forced to pay a massive fine that required him to sell his family estate. This experience seems to have radicalized him, convincing him that only extreme measures could save English Catholicism. He saw the state not just as an oppressor, but as a tyrannical force that had to be annihilated. The plan Catesby devised was breathtaking in its audacity and horrifying in its scope. To use gunpowder to blow the king, his ministers, the bishops, judges, and the entire Protestant ruling class to kingdom come during the state opening of Parliament. The explosion was to be the catalyst for a popular uprising in the Midlands. The plotters would then kidnap the king's 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and install her on the throne as a puppet Catholic monarch. To execute this apocalyptic vision, Catesby began to recruit a small, committed crew. He turned first to his trusted relatives and friends, men bound by blood, faith, and a shared sense of grievance. There was his cousin, Thomas Wintour, the fiery John Wright, and Thomas Percy, a relative of the powerful Earl of Northumberland. They took a solemn oath of secrecy together in May 1604. But they knew they needed someone else, a man with military grit, an outsider with nerves of steel who understood the logistics of explosives, and crucially, someone whose face would not be recognized in the tight-knit circles of London society. Thomas Wintour found that man in Flanders. His name was Guido Fawkes, or Guy Fawkes. Born a Protestant in York, Fawkes's early life gave little hint of the zealot he would become. However, after his father's death, his mother married a Catholic, and under his stepfather's influence, the young Fawkes converted. Driven by a newfound fiery faith, he left England to fight for Catholic Spain in the 80 Years' War against the Protestant Dutch rebels. For over a decade, he served with distinction, earning a reputation as a courageous, dependable, and pious soldier. A contemporary described him as a man of mild and cheerful demeanor, an enemy of broils and disputes, a faithful friend. But he was also a hardened professional soldier, an expert in siege warfare and the use of explosives. Recruited by Wintour, Fawkes returned to England, a country he had not seen in years. He was given the most critical role in the entire conspiracy. He would be the one to guard the powder and light the fuse. The plotters' first plan was to dig a mine from an adjacent building, tunneling under the foundations of the House of Lords. But fate intervened. They were able to lease a stone-vaulted undercroft, a cellar located directly beneath the House of Lords itself. Over the ensuing months, working under the cover of darkness, they moved 36 barrels of gunpowder into the cellar, hiding them beneath stacks of firewood and iron bars to intensify the blast. They were convinced they were God's chosen instruments, ready to remake the nation with a single, world-shaking explosion that would echo through eternity. As the moonless night of November 4th, 1605, bled into the early hours of Tuesday, the 5th, everything was finally in place. Deep in the musty cellar, Guy Fawkes made his final checks. He was armed with a slow match, a fuse designed to burn at a predictable rate, and a watch, a valuable piece of technology at the time, to time the explosion to perfection. Above him, the kingdom slept, blissfully unaware of the cataclysm waiting to be unleashed. But the conspiracy, so meticulously planned for over a year and a half, was already unraveling. The fatal crack had appeared 10 days earlier, on the evening of October 26th. A nobleman named William Parker, the 4th Baron Monteagle, was at his house in Hoxton when a servant handed him a letter delivered by an unknown man in the street. The letter was anonymous and written in a disguised, unsteady hand. It carried a cryptic but urgent warning. "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. They shall receive a terrible blow this parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." Monteagle was a Catholic, and his brother-in-law, Francis Tresham, was one of the recently recruited plotters. The letter's author is still debated, but Tresham is the most likely suspect, likely trying to save his relative without betraying his co-conspirators. Spooked by the sinister message, Monteagle did not burn the letter as it advised. Instead, he rode immediately to Whitehall and handed it to Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury and the King's chief minister. Cecil, a master of statecraft and intelligence, was already aware of certain stirrings among Catholic dissenters. He chose to wait, letting the plot ripen so he could catch all involved. He showed the letter to King James upon the monarch's return from a hunting trip on November 1st. While some of his counselors dismissed the warning as a hoax, James, a man with a deeply paranoid nature and a history of surviving assassination attempts, fixated on the phrase, "a terrible blow." He believed it pointed directly to an explosion involving gunpowder. On November 4th, the king ordered a search. The first, a perfunctory sweep during the day, revealed nothing more than a large pile of firewood in the cellar, attended by a servant named John Johnson. Fawkes, cool under pressure, explained it belonged to his master, Thomas Percy. But the mention of Percy, a known Catholic agitator, only heightened suspicion. The king demanded a second, more thorough search. Just after midnight, a search party led by Sir Thomas Knivet stormed the cellars. There they found the same man, John Johnson, now dressed in a cloak and hat, with boots and spurs on, as if ready to make a swift departure. They immediately placed him under arrest. A search of his person revealed matches and touchwood. Then they began to dismantle the woodpile. Beneath it, they found what they were looking for, barrel after barrel of gunpowder, 36 in all. The plot was exposed. Fawkes was dragged before the king's privy council in the royal bedchamber. He was defiant, almost arrogant. When one of the Scottish lords on the council contemptuously asked him what he intended to do with so much powder, Fawkes allegedly shot back that his goal was to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. His sheer nerve impressed even King James, who later remarked that the prisoner possessed a Roman resolution. But that fleeting moment of respect did nothing to cool the king's white-hot rage. This was more than just an assassination attempt. It was a profound theological and personal assault. James I was a fervent believer in the divine right of kings, the idea that his authority came directly from God, and that an attack on the king was an attack on God himself. He was a scholar who had written his own book, Demonology, on the nature of witchcraft and demonic evil. In his eyes, this plot was a satanic conspiracy against God's anointed ruler. In a speech to Parliament a few days later, he would describe the plot's horrible and fearful cruelty, an act intended to destroy not just him, but the entire body of the state. He was determined to unearth every last root of the conspiracy. On November 6th, the king put pen to paper, personally authorizing the use of torture on the man still known as John Johnson. The use of torture was technically forbidden by English common law, but it could be sanctioned by royal prerogative. James's chilling letter to the Tower of London laid out his instructions with cold precision. If he will not other ways confess, the king wrote, the gentler tortures are first to be used upon him, and then step by step you may employ the harsher, and so God speed your good work. The royal warrant was sealed. Guy Fawkes was sent to the Tower, and the full, terrifying weight of the state was about to come crashing down upon him. The Tower of London was more than a prison. It was a machine, an ancient and dreaded instrument of state power designed to break men, body and soul. For Guy Fawkes, the ordeal began in the custody of Sir William Waad, the lieutenant of the Tower. Waad was a seasoned inquisitor, a devout Protestant with a deep-seated hatred of Catholics who had honed his skills investigating plots against Queen Elizabeth. The interrogations took place in the Great Hall of the Queen's House, a timber-framed building overlooking the Tower Green, a place that would soon be a memorial to Waad's success in foiling the plot. As the king had commanded, the process began with the gentler tortures. This likely meant the application of manacles. Fawkes would have been hung by his wrists from iron rings on the wall, his feet dangling just above the floor. The agony would have been immense and immediate, an excruciating, tearing pain in the shoulders, arms, and back as gravity did its slow, dislocating work. For days, Fawkes held out. His military discipline, forged in the brutal battlefields of Europe, and his fervent religious faith acted as a shield against the pain and the interrogators' questions. He refused to name his co-conspirators, his resolve described by Waad as a most stubborn and perverse humor, as dogged as if he were possessed. But the state was not patient, and its tools of persuasion were many. With Fawkes remaining defiant, the order came from the king and his council to proceed, by degrees, to the worst. In the lexicon of Jacobean torture, this meant one thing: the rack. The rack was a terrifyingly simple and brutally effective machine. It was a large, solid wooden frame, raised from the floor, with rollers at each end. The prisoner's ankles were fastened to the bottom roller and his wrists to the top. An interrogator, often the hangman, would use a lever or bar to slowly turn the rollers, which pulled in opposite directions. The process was a slow, methodical disassembly of a human being. First, the muscles would stretch to their breaking point, screaming in protest. Then, cartilage would tear, and ligaments would snap with an audible pop. Finally, as the tension became unbearable, joints would be wrenched from their sockets, shoulders, elbows, knees, and hips dislocated one by one. The pain was beyond imagination, a white-hot, all-consuming agony designed to produce not just information, but a complete psychological collapse. We do not have a precise record of how many times Fawkes was subjected to the rack, but we know it worked. A letter from December of 1605 noted that Fawkes confessed nothing during the first racking but finally broke when told he must come to it again and again, from day to day. Under this unimaginable and repeated torment, his shield of faith and discipline finally shattered. The soldiers will dissolved into pure, animal pain. The collapse was swift. On November 7th, after holding out for 2 days, he confessed his real name, Guy Fawkes. Over the next 2 days, the floodgates opened. He began to name his co-conspirators, laying out the entire architecture of the plot for his tormentors. But the most gut-wrenching evidence of his ordeal isn't found in the words of his confession, it's in his signature. After giving his final, detailed confession, he was required to sign the document. 2 of his signatures from this period survive. The first, from before the worst of the torture was applied, is clear and firm: Guido Fawkes. It is the signature of a man in control of his faculties. But the second signature, on his final confession dated November 9th, is a barely legible, tremulous scrawl. It looks like the scratching of a wounded animal. The name Guido is there, but it is distorted, a weak and spidery trace of a man who has been utterly destroyed. The hand that was steady enough to light a fuse that would have destroyed a kingdom could no longer hold a pen. That twisted signature is the most powerful testament to the agony he endured, a physical record, written in the language of pure suffering, of his breaking point. While Guy Fawkes was being systematically broken in the Tower, a frantic hunt for the other plotters was raging across the English countryside. Hearing that the plot had been discovered, Catesby and the others had fled London, desperately trying to incite the Catholic gentry of the Midlands into the popular revolt they had planned. But there was no uprising. Their fellow Catholics, horrified by the news and fearing the inevitable backlash, wanted nothing to do with them. The fugitives were cornered on the evening of November 7th at Holbesh House in Staffordshire. In a moment of grim, poetic irony, their flight ended with a gunpowder accident of their own. While trying to dry out their damp powder in front of a fire, a stray spark ignited a bag, engulfing Catesby and several others in a flash of flame. Though wounded, they were determined to die fighting. When the Sheriff of Worcester and his men stormed the house the next morning, the remaining plotters made their last stand. The charismatic leader, Robert Catesby, and his loyal friend Thomas Percy were allegedly struck down by the same musket ball and died soon after. The 8 survivors, including a scorched Ambrose Rookwood and Thomas Wintour, were captured and brought to London to face the King's justice. Their trial in Westminster Hall on January 27, 1606, was a foregone conclusion. It was not a process of justice, but a piece of carefully orchestrated political theater, designed to publicly condemn the men and their faith. Presided over by a panel of commissioners, the prosecution was led by the formidable Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke. All 8 survivors were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to the most horrific punishment the law allowed: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This fate was reserved for the most heinous enemies of the state. It was not merely an execution, it was a gruesome, ritualized dismemberment intended to be the ultimate deterrent. The process was a symphony of state-sanctioned cruelty. First, the condemned was drawn, lashed to a wooden hurdle, like a section of fence, and dragged by a horse through the filthy, cobblestone streets to the place of execution, ensuring he arrived bruised, battered, and humiliated. Then he was hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive and conscious. At this point, the real horror began. The barely living man would be publicly castrated and disemboweled. His entrails and genitals would be burned in a fire before his own eyes. Finally, he would be beheaded, and his body hacked into 4 pieces or quartered. These gruesome remains would then be parboiled and dipped in pitch for preservation before being put on public display across the kingdom, on city gates or London Bridge, as a grisly warning against treason. On January 31st, 1606, it was Guy Fawkes' turn. The executions were staged in the Old Palace Yard at Westminster, directly opposite the Parliament building he had plotted to destroy. One by one, he watched his remaining comrades suffer their terrible fates. When his moment came, Fawkes, frail and broken from weeks of torture, was the last to climb the scaffold. According to contemporary accounts, he was so weak that he needed the hangman's help to even begin his ascent up the ladder. But in these final moments, with what little strength he had left, he managed one last, small act of defiance. He jumped from the ladder. The fall, combined with the weight of the noose, was enough to break his neck, killing him instantly. It was a small mercy, but a significant one. Guy Fawkes had cheated the executioner out of the agony of being disemboweled while still alive. His lifeless body, however, did not escape the full sentence. It was still drawn, quartered, and the pieces sent to the four corners of the kingdom, a final, grisly message from a triumphant and vengeful state. The story of the Gunpowder Plot is far more than just a failed conspiracy. It's a chilling, unsparing look at the absolute power of the state and the terrifying lengths to which it will go to preserve itself. Here at History's Chronicles of Horror, we believe that understanding the past requires staring into its darkest corners. If you find these brutal truths behind the legends as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that exhume the grim realities of history. The failure of the Gunpowder Plot had immediate and devastating consequences. Far from improving their situation, the plot unleashed a new wave of anti-Catholic paranoia and persecution. Harsher laws were passed, barring Catholics from professions like law and the military, and requiring a new oath of allegiance that renounced the Pope's authority over the king. These measures would deepen religious divides in Britain for centuries to come. In January 1606, Parliament passed the Thanksgiving Act, establishing November 5th as an annual day of public commemoration for the plot's failure, to be marked by church services and bonfires. This tradition eventually morphed into the Bonfire Night we know today, where effigies of the guy are still burned across Britain. But the plot's legacy is more complex than a simple celebration of deliverance. For the Jacobean state, it was a masterful piece of propaganda. The story of Guy Fawkes' torment wasn't just about punishing a traitor. It was about demonstrating the absolute, terrifying, and inescapable power of the crown. It was a warning, written in blood, fire, and the ink of a forced confession, that the state wouldn't just defeat its enemies. It would utterly break them, disassemble them piece by piece, and turn their failed plots into a public spectacle of their own destruction. It is a grim and enduring lesson from history that still echoes in the conversations we have today about security, state power, and the nature of rebellion.